Hello again, Netrunner fans. Willingdon here, and I'm back again for another data pack review. In this one, we're going to be looking at the Valley. This is the first pack in the Sand cycle. This is the fourth such cycle in Android Netrunner. I'm going to break with tradition a bit in this episode. We're going to be looking at the runner cards in this first video because those are the first cards that appear in the pack. We'll be looking at the Corp cards, of course, in the second part of the video. We're going to kick things off with a card that I think has caused a lot of stir in the community. This is a new program for Anarch called Clot. It's 2 to install, 1 MU, 2 influence, and it's a virus. The Corp cannot score an agenda on the same turn he or she installed it. Trash Clot if the Corp purges virus counters. So before I give my opinion on this card, let's talk about why this ability would be useful. There's a lot of different corporation decks that aim to fast advance their agendas or score their agendas out of hand. Basically, the idea being they have some mechanism to be able to play and score the agenda in a turn. And the big thing about that is that the runner won't have an opportunity to make runs against that server since he won't get a turn in that time. So against decks that are looking to score this way, if you have Clot in play, they're going to have to deal with it before they're going to be able to score out of their hand. And I think for the most part, it isn't going to be good enough just to purge virus counters once or twice, because I think most of the decks that play Clot are probably also going to have access to like Clone Chip or some kind of recursion. Now, this won't stop them from scoring the agendas the old-fashioned way. So if they're able to just set up a good remote server and score an agenda like in a standard deck would, then this isn't going to have any effect. But I think for most fast advanced decks, it's not very easy to do that. A lot of fast advanced decks don't really have enough ice or the type of ice they need to build really strong remote servers. This might change now that Clot is in the metagame. And when you add in that Clot is going to be pretty easy to tutor up, within Anarch you can tutor it up with Jin, with Shaper, you're going to have, all the Shaper tutor stuff. It's probably only Criminal that doesn't have a good way to find this card in their deck. So I think it's fair to say that Clot is going to have a pretty huge impact on the way players build fast advance decks and the way they think about fast advance. The fact that there's now this silver bullet card that is pretty easy to locate that really shuts them down. I think in the past we've only maybe had like the source and a handful of other ways to increase the cost of agendas or somehow hose the fast advanced decks. This card just so obviously hits them, and it hits them hard, and it's going to be pretty easy and cheap to play in your deck as a one-of. I'm kind of conflicted on this card. On one hand, I really don't like dedicated narrow hoser cards that all they do is negate a specific strategy, and this is very, very, very obviously that. The thing I don't like about those cards is basically they're worthless outside of that function, and I think Clot is definitely that. Like, you're not going to play Clot in your deck because it has synergy or interaction with anything you're doing, and in a lot of matchups the card's just going to do absolutely nothing. So if you're up against RP or something like that, Clot is just worthless. So this is the type of card that you're going to play maybe 1 or 2 of in your deck, and you're probably going to have things like Jin to tutor it up, or things like the Shaper tutor effects to get it up in play early in the game so that you can hate out the fast advanced decks. Now, the reason I say I'm conflicted is that the hoser cards do exist, regardless of me liking them or not. And I think that if we are going to have them in the game, it makes a lot of sense to have them for fast advance. I think that the fast advance decks could maybe use a kick in the rear where they're required to metagame more against anticipated hosers like Clot. I think that we've already started to see that thing occurring with the Scorched Earth metagame, and I think that it's made the flatline decks involving meat damage a lot more interesting. Wayland players nowadays have a lot of different ways to deal with Plascrete and some of the other hosers they might see, from hardware removal to additional meat damage effects to things like mid-season replacements against avoid tag effects. And I think that's made a lot of interesting choices for the flatline players. There isn't kind of a default way to play. So I'm hoping that we're going to see more of that now that we have Clot and another card in this pack. And I'm hoping that the fast advanced metagame will develop some different solutions and it won't just be as cookie cutter as we've kind of seen in the past. The next card that we have is Paige Piper. She is a resource connection, 0 to play, and 2 influence for Anarch. The first time you install a card each turn, including her, you may search your stack for any number of copies of that card and add them to your heap, then shuffle your stack. So basically this card is going to let us thin extra copies of a card out of our deck once we've played one copy of that card. So the thing that I'm seeing that's going to be most useful for this is actually involving the genetics cards that we're going to talk about later in the pack. But generally the principle is if you play a lot of cards that are unique and you have multiple copies of them, it's really useful to be able to search through your deck and just get rid of all the junk copies. Now, I could also see potentially this being good if you had some sort of heap interaction effect. So I could see this being really good if you had some way to utilize extra copies of like a particular program or something like that in your heap. I think mostly though the use of this card is going to be the ability to thin extra copies of cards that you don't want out of your deck so that when you draw cards you're going to be drawing more business. Lately I've seen a lot of Quetzal decks that play deep red for a bunch of MU for things like Overmind, and then they also play Supplier to reduce the cost of a lot of their resources and just things that they play. This card might be pretty good in that deck because you have E3 a lot of times, and then also the 2 cards I mentioned. All of these, you just want one of them, and then you're going to just draw useless copies of them later. But you kind of need to play 3 so that you draw one early enough in the game. So Paige Piper might be pretty good in that sort of deck. Overall, I really like the design of this card. It gives Anarch another way to manipulate cards, but it's in a unique way that no other faction can do. Next, we have the first of the genetics cards, and these are kind of the theme for the pack. These are all resource genetics, and this is the Anarch one. It's called Adjusted Chronotype. It is unique, 3 to play, and it's 2 influence. The first time you lose a click each turn, gain a click. Well, this card is going to make more sense when we see some of the other genetics cards in the pack, but I would just like to put out there that this card is actually pretty good just on its own. There's already quite a few effects that cause us to lose a click that are really strong. Wildside is like the core set staple that has defined Anarch. I think it's fallen out of popularity a lot recently, especially after Order and Chaos, but it is still a staple of Anarch. And we also have a handful of other cards that have been kind of unplayable, like Hard at Work. So there's already some ways to utilize this within Anarch, and I think when we see what some of the other genetics cards are capable of, this is going to make a little bit more sense. So I think for now I'm going to reserve judgment on this card. Next up we have a new icebreaker for Criminal. This is called Spike. It is 1 to play, 1 MU, 0 strength, and 2 influence. Icebreaker, Fractor, Cloud. We haven't seen Cloud for quite some time. If you have at least 2 link, the memory cost of Spike is 0, even if it's not installed. That's the Cloud part. Spike has +1 strength for each installed Icebreaker. Trash, break up to 3 barrier subroutines. I'm pretty underwhelmed with this Icebreaker. In general, the strength thing is going to be a problem. I think unless you are playing a rig that already has access to like multiple data suckers, and even then I think it might be hard to use this, you're going to run into lots of strength problems. Even if we assume that you have 4 icebreakers in play, which I think is more than you're really going to have even with a complete rig, you're still going to run into a lot of barriers, especially against Blue Sun, that you're not going to be able to deal with. So right now, I think it's going to be hard to justify this card even with the Data Sucker rig. I think I've been playing Breach and Corroder. I think that's pretty common for criminal lists right now. And I don't really see why you'd want to play this over those unless you had some funky scheme to try to save the influence that you would spend on 1 or 2 Corroders. So I don't know. I'm pretty underwhelmed with this thing. I think maybe it could have some limited playability. And I think if you had the ability to actually capitalize on the cloud, or had the ability to recur it, or for some reason had a ton of icebreakers in play, all of those things could maybe make this a little more playable. But right now I'm thinking that it's going to be really hard to do any of those things. So this is probably going to stay in the box for me. Next we have the Criminal Genetics card, and this is called Enhanced Vision. It's a 1-to-play resource genetics, 3 influence, and it's unique like the other one was. The first time you make a successful run each turn, the corp reveals 1 card at random from HQ. Well, like with the Anarch one, that effect is really strong on its own. I think that there are a fair number of Andy decks that do the Data Sucker Desperado thing that are going to at least consider this card, just because it's really cheap, and I feel like it could pretty easily pay the 1 credit and deck slot investment in information from the random card from HQ. Especially if you're all the time making successful runs. If the deck that you are playing, like the Andy deck, is going to make a successful run basically every turn, it's going to probably be worth it to get this little bit of extra information. And I think especially in Criminal, where a lot of your big strikes on HQ are either legwork or account siphon, so you're probably not just making a lot of regular runs on HQ, or I would say very rarely do I find that line of play successful. This is going to be really nice to give you that extra information in HQ. All around, I think this is pretty powerful. I think its role in the genetics suite is maybe something to talk about once we look at the rest of them. But I think that in general, this seems like it has a fair amount of playability, assuming that you can kind of build your deck around the successful run thing. The next 2 cards that we have are both genetics cards for Shaper. The first one is Gene Conditioning Shop, and that's shop with SHOPPE, like the old-timey shop. This is a resource location. It's 2 to play, 1 influence. Genetics also trigger the second time each turn their trigger condition is met. So with the other genetics cards I kind of mentioned, like that they were good on their own, but there might be a way to build a genetics-oriented strategy, I think this is clearly the driver behind the genetics-oriented strategy. I think if you're willing to commit, you're going to get quite a bit of value, especially with the Anarch one, being able to get 2 clicks back for effects that cause you to lose clicks. That could be really, really strong if you're able to set that up, especially early in the game. And the fact that this is only 1 influence is going to make this reasonable to accomplish in those Anarch decks. Now, it is worth mentioning that 2 of this wouldn't stack, since they both trigger the second time. So, these would both work, but they just wouldn't give you a cumulative effect. So that, I guess, is a thing. Like, you're not going to be able to get a million triggers off of your genetics things, but I think gaining 2 clicks every turn back for effects that cause you to lose clicks, like that alone could be pretty strong. The Criminal one would be kind of okay, and the other 2 that we're going to talk about I think maybe aren't quite as good. I think the Anarch one is probably the best. So we'll revisit this card a little bit when we get to the other genetics cards. The second Shaper Genetics card is Synthetic Blood. It is 3 to play, 2 influence, resource genetics. The first time you take damage each turn, draw a card. Well, I don't mean to repeat myself too much, but like I said with the other two, this is pretty good on its own. I think that this is maybe comparable to playing something like Net Shield against PE. This is going to be pretty good against PE because you're going to be able to trigger it each turn. And I think that one of the strengths of PE is that they do damage to you on both turns. So with this in play, you're going to be able to negate like the first Neural EMP, the first agenda they score, the first agenda you steal, the first House of Knives use, like a bunch of different effects. This is going to suck up quite a bit of damage in the form of replacing the card with a draw. So I see this being reasonably decent, just as maybe like an anti-Jinteki card, but I think the 3 cost and the fact that it's a resource is going to maybe hold it back a little bit. I'm probably not going to be immediately getting rid of all my feedback filters for this, but I think if you were already playing a genetic strategy, this would be really insane and could really help you a lot in terms of overcoming damage effects. So I really like the design of this. I would like to see more anti-Jinteki cards or anti-just damage cards, and I think this is a really interesting way to do it, especially built into the genetics cycle. So again, another strong resource that I think has a fair amount of playability. The next card that we have is a new current, and this is a neutral one. It's called Traffic Jam. It's 2 to play, no influence, and it's a current, so that means that it's not trashed until another current is played or the corpse scores an agenda. The advancement requirement of each agenda is increased by 1 for each copy of that agenda in the corpse score area. There are definitely some comparisons to be made to Clot with this card. The reason I say that is that a lot of fast advanced decks use AstroScript pilot program as kind of the core of their scoring scheme. And what's kind of been known as the Astro Train is going to be stopped by this. And what I mean by Astro Train is once you've scored one AstroScript, it's easy to score another AstroScript because of the counter that you get from the first one. And then once you scored the second one, you have another counter, so it's easy to score a third one. And that's 6 points. It makes it pretty easy to win. This card is going to stop that, or it's at least going to make it a lot more difficult. They're not going to be able to score the second AstroScript out of hand. They're going to have something like a Sansan or a Biotic Labor in addition to that AstroScript counter. So I think this kind of has some comparisons to Clot. It's certainly easier in some respects to use versus Clot because it's just a neutral current. And the fact that it's a current is kind of nice because it deals with like enhanced login protocol and some other stuff like that. That said, I don't think that this card is as good as Clot against like as a dedicated anti-fast advance card because you're not going to have the recursion and the tutor capability you would have with a program. But it does give Criminal an option against fast advance. Like I was saying with Clot, I don't think it's very easy to play Clot in most Criminal decks. It's really going to be shoehorned in there, especially when you're paying the influence for it as well. And Traffic Jam is going to be a lot easier to include in those decks. One thing I like about the design of this card versus Clot is that this card's going to at least do a little bit against every corp. Like against RP, for example, if they've scored a Future Perfect, it's going to be a lot harder for them to score a second one since it's now going to be 6 counters and that's kind of a 3-turn investment. I don't know how often they were really scoring 2 Future Perfects to begin with, but at least this card has some flexibility and does a little bit of something against the decks that aren't fast advance. The last resource in the pack is also genetics. This is a neutral one called Symmetrical Visage. It's 2 to play and it's 0 influence. The first time you spend a click to draw a card, not through a card ability, each turn gain 1 credit. Well, as a neutral card, I think this one's pretty obviously the weakest of the three, though I don't think it's really that bad. It's basically a one-time use of professional contacts. I think maybe if you were okay with the idea that you were just going to use this once every turn, it could be playable. But I think in general, you're probably going to want to have the Gene Conditioning Shop if you're playing this card. So in general, I think this card is pretty limited in use. It's probably going to be mainly used with the Gene Conditioning Shop, but I think that it's not just a terrible card outside of that context. So especially in the genetics focused deck, like if you were playing the Gene Conditioning Shop with this card's going to do something prior to you drawing the Gene Conditioning Shop. And I could maybe see some decks including it as a cheaper to initially install, but limited in use professional contacts. Well, that's going to do it for part one of my review. I think there were a lot of interesting things going on in this runner pack, and I really liked the theme, the fact that there was kind of two themes running through the pack with Clot and Traffic Jam as well as the genetics cards. So I really like that they have these kind of self-contained cycles of cards in packs. Be sure to tune in to part two where we look at the corp cards in the pack. And if you like this video, press subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up. I'll see you over in part two of the video.